Welcome everyone, welcome to this fourth conference of the Groupe d'études géopolitiques, Geopolitical Studies Group cycle. We are here today with Thomas Piketty. It is so good to see you all here in the Jean Jaurès amphitheater. And of course, we'd like to also welcome those who couldn't be here with us in the room, but who are in the room next door. I'd like to thank a couple of people as well who made this day possible. I'd like to thank Rome. We have the honor today to have a debate with the former Minister of Economy Tremonti, Bernard Cour as well. You've welcomed a several number of representatives from well-known universities. Here you have the poster for the École Normale in Italy, where we have organized a debate to answer to Mr. Piketty. We also have another event organized. Well, of course, yes, we need to thank Lisboa as well. They decided to organize with Sciences Politique Department a debate. I'm afraid I can't really pronounce the names, Eduardo Passoferrer and Joao Cominino. Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you as well to Denmark, with the Cultural Institute in France, in partnership with the cultural website as well. I'm afraid I can't pronounce the names right here as well, but I'm sure that the debate is going to be very interesting. There'll also be a discussion following this intervention. We are also webcasting in Eastern Europe, also in Germany, Berlin, Dresden, Budapest. Here you have Ljubljana's graphist as well. Thank you very much for deploying our logo, hiding the Balkanic states. I don't know what it means from a subconscious point of view, but we also have Mr. Dolar here as a major Slovenian philosopher, and he'll be responding to Mr. Piketty's intervention afterwards. We are also webcasted in Estonia, and you can see that yesterday there was a debate following on the third conference that we've organized within this cycle, and the conference was happening in Riga, Estonia's capital. Right, so we are now following on with our conference. It is also the opportunity for you to get in touch with us on our Twitter account. You have the Twitter hashtag here appearing on the screen. Just to say a few words about what we're trying to do here, we're trying to have an intellectual debate at the global and continental scale. We realize that Europe is everywhere, the EU is everywhere, but we also realize that when it comes to debating, well, we are still very much limited. We remain very much at the national scale, and we also realize that many sectors are now impacted by EU regulations and the European Union. So the idea is to break down the silos and to get in touch with as many people across Europe. And of course, I'd like to ask Mr. Piketty to give us his idea of Europe. Thank you very much, Mr. Piketty. Thank you. Thank you very much to the organizers. The title that was given to this conference, Inequalities in Europe, well, this might be paradoxical in a way that we very often hear that, and I say so myself, that in fact Europe is rather preserved when it comes to inequalities, that it is a space of equalities rather. So I'd like to start with this statement, and of course to say that yes, it is in a way true. There are some indicators that show that Europe is globally an equalitarian region. But I'd like to also very quickly mention the limits of this observation to see how fragile the European social model is. I think that we need to change our mindset to stop considering that we should explain to opinions that they should not complain, that there are not as many inequalities in Europe than in the US, so that everything is fine, that they should not complain. No, I don't think that this is convincing enough. I think that our citizens deserve better. It's not exactly true either. So, and this might lead to more dangerous situations, and even the Brexit, I think, did not allow us to realize exactly what's going to happen and change our mindset. I'd like to also, in a third point, see how we could create a space of equality, an area of equality, how we could transform democracy. I think this is the issue at stake, how we can reform political institutions in Europe so that we can carry out egalitarian policies, so that there must be something more to this space of free trade and free movement. Europe is a matrix of egalitarian area, but it's also a combination of everything that it went wrong with globalization. So it is a free trade market without any social regulation or any taxation regulations in place. I'd like to also mention a few proposals that we already made last year when it comes to democracy in Europe, with a bunch of friends, Stéphane Yenné, Mr. Duchesne, Mr. Sacré as well. We wrote together a treaty on the democratization of Europe. It's not so much a solution in itself. It's not a complete process. I think that we need to work further into it, and I'd be happy to debate these issues with you later on. But I think that we need to have this debate in any case. We need to stop considering that nothing will ever change, that the treaties will not change, that the institutions will remain as they are. No, we need to change, and the situation does change. At the end of 2011, we did have a change of treaty. I didn't think that it was the right one, but we did change the treaty. And we need to get prepared as well so that ideas can play a much bigger role in the next crisis to come. And also, as you know, changes never really happen in the way that we plan for them in history, but this is a source for us of debate as the one that we're organizing today, and I think that these debates can really play a major role as well. Right, so I'd like to come back on the fact that yes, the Europe is a space of equality compared to the US or other regions. Yes, that might be true. In some way, it is true. If you take the European social model, it was set up in the aftermath of the Second World War. It was relying on the idea of equal access to a certain number of services. So therefore, yes, to fundamental goods, to health system, to social insurance. So in most of European countries, be them at the western or eastern side of Europe, present some common values, even though, of course, there are some disparities and variations from one country to the other. There are some relative inequalities when it comes to access to financing, to education. When it comes to financing, some countries have privatized funding, and others rely on local municipalities. So there are some social and political institutions in place that offer protective system, which meant that Europe could prevent the rise of inequalities in some way in Europe. So I'll give you some figures. You'll find them on the report on inequalities that was published in December 2017 in the English version and in 2018 in the French version. And of course, it is freely available on the internet. So what's new with this report compared to what I wrote in the past is that now we have a global vision of inequalities, including emerging countries as well. I think that to me what's very interesting and why my book was such a success is because it allowed me to have access to huge amounts of data. I had the way to put pressure on governments in Southern America, in Korea, in China in some ways, in Russia as well. So I had access to financial data that were inaccessible beforehand, and that allowed us to compare the situation at the global level and to look at the inequality trends in income inequality. Because one of the major limits of this book, Capital, is that it was focusing mainly on the Western world, and we were really insisting on the role of world wars, how they had an impact on reducing inequalities. But now we also started looking at inequality regimes in Brazil, in India, which allowed us to have a deep analysis, which wasn't the case really with my book. So this was in fact one of the major limits of my books, and I'm now trying to go deeper into things and looking into new emerging countries. So if we want to compare the biggest regions of the world, if we keep one indicator, what is the share of national income, so all the national salaries and profits made by a country, going to the top 10%, the top 10% wealthiest population. Well, if we had to have full equality, then we would have a share of 10%, full inequality 100%. So the most egalitarian countries would have a share of about 20%, and the most inequalitarian countries would have between 70 and 80%. And in the past, well, 20 to 30 years, we've seen an increase in inequalities. In Europe, there was 30% beforehand. Now we have about 35% of share of national income going to the top 10%. And in other countries, we were about, in the US, we are about 50% of national income share. In Russia, which was even more inequalitarian than other countries after the fall of communism. Well, of course, at first we had a share of 20-25%, and inequalities exploded in Russia. It is now an extremely unequalitarian country. To us, the most unequalitarian region is the Middle East, where the top national income share is 70%. And there are huge disparities as well between countries, depending on their reliance on the oil revenues, depending on the population situation, depending on neighboring countries as well. So there are some disparities and inequalities amongst countries as well. Which is obviously related to the instability, political and military instability currently happening in the region. Because there are some attempts of redistributing income to those who need it the most. But globally speaking, we are now in a situation where there are many more inequalities outside of Europe than Europe. So we have the Middle East, Brazil, with income shares of 60%, Europe between 30 and 40%. So Europe seems to be rather preserved in some way. Now, that'll be it with the figures, but I'd like to mention one thing. Even if you include Eastern Europe and Western Europe, so if you include all European countries and you look at Bulgarian income and German income as well. So, of course, which are two differently populated countries. Well, of course, this increases total inequalities because you add Eastern European countries, but not so much in the end. If you look at total inequality in Europe, with so from the 450 million Western Europeans to the 500 something million living in Eastern Europe, then well you'll have inequalities going from 35 to 38%, so it's increasing but not so much, whereas in the US we are still at 50% top national income share. And you can also look at disparities between Mexico and Canada. If you look at Mexico, for example, if you look at a huge economic area, so if you want to compare European countries with an area which is as comparable, such as the US, Canada, and Mexico. They also have similar trade relations, and therefore, if you were to include all these two countries to the US, then of course inequalities would increase as well. So that's also interesting to look at inequalities not only at the national level, but also at continental level, regional level. Well, it's very difficult to look at inequality at a global level, of course. There are huge areas to cover, and in some areas it's difficult to sometimes have the data. There are some institutions that are not often in common. They don't have much in common. Sometimes the institutions in place are difficult to assess, but it is quite interesting to look at what are the impacts of inequalities. And sometimes you do realize that yes, Europe, despite all the limits that you can find in Europe, even though you include Eastern European countries to Western European countries, despite all the tensions that appear between countries, well, it does remain an area, a continent, where inequalities are rather limited. But on this particular topic, we sometimes read some rather odd things. People saying that the European space is very much hierarchical. Well, this is not so much. I mean, it might be true, but if you look at both Eastern Europe and Western Europe, it doesn't. You'll never get inequality rates that are as high as in the US. This is absolutely wrong to think that way. Right. So I just wanted to mention this at first. So it's a rather positive and optimistic point of view that we have here. We have managed to adopt a certain number of social legislations that allowed us to get here, but we can't simply pat ourselves on the back, and we need to look as well at the limits, and we need to see as well if these European comparisons have a sense, because it's one thing to say to French and Italian and Bulgarian citizens, well, you shouldn't complain, you should look at Brazil. No, this has no sense. There's no sense in saying that. What Europeans have seen in the past 20 to 40 years is that we're seeing more and more inequalities in Europe. There is an increase of the highest income and highest wealth as well in Europe. And if you look at the 1930s, for example, we had here a decrease of inequality in the end in terms of income growth for those who have a job and those who for the majority of the population, the income has not increased as much as the cost of living has. So there are some inequalities, and you don't need to be a statistic guru to see that when it comes to wealth, then the population is doing well. I mean, there are some fortunes out there producing 6 to 8% growth per year, which is not obviously the average rate for the commoners. So it's quite difficult for us to explain to Europeans that we really need as a priority to ban taxation on wealth. And that's very difficult to actually explain to to the citizens. If you look at the elections, well, the first round of election in France, the right-wing candidate was very much focusing on the most wealthiest population, so therefore he did have a policy plan for them. But to come back to most recent events, I'd like to come back a little bit and to perhaps have a more historical approach, to come back in time and to look at the evolution of the European social model. How is it a fragile model? Well, there are a few things that we can look at, I think. First of all, the decrease of inequalities in Europe and the way Europe has become a space where there are relatively few inequalities. Well, this didn't happen necessarily after a well-thought political process. It wasn't exactly prepared or anything. It happened in a chaotic manner after tragic historical events that took place. And I think that in the end we didn't really think the process through. We didn't really see what would be the implications these modifications would have on inequalities. We didn't really think of a fair distribution of income. So we need to go back in time and to look at how we got to that situation and how today there is an increase in inequality and how we can explain it. So Europe has not always been an egalitarian space. We did mention the US, but for a very long time, in fact, it was the opposite. The US were more egalitarian than Europe for quite a long time in terms of wealth distribution, all the way to the First World War. In fact, then there were a lot more inequalities in Europe, all the way till First World War, which led to obviously dramatic historic events, but also high inflation, which had a huge impact on the population, and the whole political class as well changed its mindset. They decided to implement social security, a certain number of social benefits. But this did not happen overnight in a natural, simple way. If you go back even more in time, back then there was a lot of hope in the way the French revolution would spontaneously lead to the decrease in inequality. In the way this was absolutely wrong to hope so. If people tend to think that as long as we ban privileges, as long as anyone can have access to any type of job, if you want to become a taxi driver or if you want to be a baker, then therefore if you have access to these jobs it will decrease inequalities. But this is very much artificial. It's not a natural way of thinking things. Inequalities will not necessarily decrease. Now, back in time after, at the end of the 19th century, Durkheim thought that, with political rationalization, well, it is highly possible that in the 20th century we will put in an end to inheritance tax. But then, or to property tax, and we know that it's not the case today. There are still inheritance taxes, and it's still very much difficult to find an apartment in Paris. So all throughout the 19th century, all throughout the Third Republic in France, there were some attempts, but it never really went the way it was supposed to. it's not correct as well to think that France is much more egalitarian than our neighboring countries. Historically speaking, France is the last European country and also the last country in the Western world compared to Australia, Canada, US, New Zealand, Japan. It is the last country to implement income tax. And so this was about a century ago, and this law was adopted by the Senate. The Senate was being resistant for 30 years. It was adopted on the 15th of July 1914, and it was only to support financial efforts during the war against Germany. This wasn't really to pay for schools or anything. But so for a very long time there was huge resistance from the Senate, and it was only the obligation of war that led the Senate to adopt the law. So today, obviously, well, back then, obviously, there were many oppositions to income tax. Many thought, well, you know, we've gone through the French Revolution, so we are an egalitarian country. We don't need to have a progressive tax on income. If you take the UK, well, obviously they are a monarchy, so they need it. Germany as well, they need it, but we don't need it because we already put an end to inequalities thanks to the French Revolution. And yet, if you look at what happened in 1930, there was a concentration of landowners that was as concentrated in France as anywhere else in Europe. Simply because there were huge inequalities between the aristocracy and the rest of the population. And in 1913, the top national income share goes to only the top 5% of the wealthiest population. So from now, obviously, I mean, the income tax has managed to reduce inequalities, but it did not have an impact on the way properties are being distributed, or it did not ease access to properties in any way. Now, this was very interesting to me to see as a researcher. Obviously, I was looking at historical data, and I realized that all these changes were not made in a reflected kind of way. It was very chaotic. Now, today, of course, we are we are probably investing 4 to 5 times more on technical students and students going to specific technical schools than rather general universities. And unfortunately today, even though we're investing more in education, it doesn't mean that more generalistic students have more access to funding. This is not the case. And again, the impact of the legislation did not have necessarily the effect that was wanted when the law was adopted. So there is some kind of hypocrisy between the ambition when adopting a law, and especially a law on education, and also some typical French hypocrisy as well. Now, I don't know whether this is also the case for all our neighboring countries or not, but in France at least, France has its own idea of and its own image of the relationship it has with other countries. So I think we need to also look at that.
After the crisis of the first part of the 21st century, the whole political, intellectual landscape was transformed, and we reduced strongly the inequalities. And from a political perspective, things changed a lot. In 1914, no one wanted the income tax, and it was only the consequence of the war that it was adopted. That was the law of the 15th of July 1914, and that rate at the time was only 2%. And the people who didn't want this law were saying, once we start, once we go along that way, we won't stop anymore. In 1920, the superior rate is risen to 60%. And it was adopted not by a left-wing National Assembly, but by a right-wing National Assembly, made of members of parliament who 10 years earlier didn't want the income tax. So this shows several things. It shows that very often, and it's still true for today, we end up doing things that we did not anticipate before. And historical events have a very strong impact, and sometimes it's a greater impact than the political wills. So at the end of the war, it's quite obvious that we need to have people contribute. The inflation is extremely high, the wages are low, and there was also the Bolshevik Revolution, which of course troubled a lot the mindsets. The people who were against the income tax in 1914 start to believe that maybe it's not such a bad idea. So, of course, the crisis in the 1930s is contributing to increase the mistrust to deregulated capitalism. I'm not going to go back in the entire history, but of course the political landscape in 1945 is completely different. And it is in this context that France and the United Kingdom with the Bevering plan, a plan which decides to implement extremely progressive income tax, because you have to know that it was the US and the UK which invented progressive income tax. In 1920, the United States decided to implement an inheritance tax which had a rate of 60 to 70%. Because they didn't want it to look like Europe, because they perceived Europe as extremely inequalitarian. So they decided to implement some extremely heavy taxes at that time. It was the highest rate of tax in the world. And that rate was different between the different states. And it didn't kill the American capitalism, because it was only applied to extremely high incomes. So it's a discussion that many people are not ready to have. However, it's the truth. It's a discussion which is here because it's part of our historical heritage, and we need to recall this. We need to remember this. We need to recall how this reduction of the inequalities was reduced in the 20th century. And this enables us as well to understand the other movement which starts in the 1970s. The equalitarian promise, which was supposedly made after the Second World War, didn't have the impact that was expected. After the Second World War, we didn't think through the long-term consequences of these plans, and I talk now about the limit of Europe today. To me, the European Union is a sort of incomplete internationalism. It's an attempt of going beyond frontiers, going beyond nations, but it is incomplete, because in a way Europe was built in the 50s and 60s first as a great market, a big market, in order to favor free movement of people and services, but without a common policy in terms of solidarity, taxation, education, environment, and so on. So that's the real obstacle today. There is a responsibility that is lacking in Europe today. Europe, because of this political fracture, because of the lack of a tax union, Europe was the first to launch the tax reform on corporate taxes. And what Trump did a few months ago was quite similar to what the Europeans did back then. At the beginning of the 1990s, the Europeans started to decrease the corporate tax. It's the equivalent of the income tax for companies, as you know. And sometimes this can be coordinated with the income tax depending on the level of revenue of the assets holders. But it's it's a good thing to tax corporate profits, and the rate of that corporate tax in the 1970s and 80s was about 40 to 50% in all of the countries of Western Europe. And then at the beginning of the 1990s, the European states decided to reduce these rates, 35%, 30%, and some countries such as Ireland decreased it even more to 20%, to 10%, some tend to 0%. And once we reach this rate of 0%, it will not be the end, because we can still provide some subsidies. So this movement was launched by Europe, and this has some impact. When you have a social model which relies on a levy rate, on a mandatory levy rate, which is about 40 to 50% of the GDP, and the European countries that have lower rates, such as 25%, are usually the less wealthy countries, such as Bulgaria or Romania, etc. And the northern European countries are, in general, the wealthiest. They have rates of 40 to 50%. So when you have a global rate which is about 40 to 50%, if you tax some incomes, such as the corporate incomes, lower than that, then it means that there will be other incomes, such as the wages, that you will have to overtax. Otherwise, you won't be able to fund your social security schemes. So this is why we started to overtax the wages in Europe, and this had consequences on the general balance of the taxation system in the European Union and in Europe, and this has been extremely negative. For a while, the United States did not follow this evolution, because the US, despite their flaws, have a federal state which took in charge the income tax and the corporate tax as federal taxes. And because it operated at a large scale, it didn't enter this mechanism of reducing the taxes. And until a few months ago, until Trump decided to launch this movement, the rate of the federal corporate tax was about 35%, so it had decreased a little bit. But you have to know that in the US, on top of the federal tax, there are the taxes at the level of the state, of the different states. So we had a level which was about 45%. And it was, in the end, Trump, 30 years after Reagan. Reagan had targeted the income tax, and Trump today is targeting the corporate tax. And he wanted to reduce it to 15%. In the end, the Senate decided on 20%, and this will completely change things, because the European countries that had decided on 15 to 20%, now they are facing the US competition. And this means that there will be a trend to go even further and to decline, to reduce even more the rates. So conversely to everything which is being said, which, you know, this belief that the tax havens do not exist anymore, actually that's not true. This tax reform of Trump was in fact following a movement which started in Europe. So we have to take responsibility for this. As Europeans, we are hurting ourselves by this lack of tax coordination, and we are also hurting the others. We have an impact on the American policies, and we are also having an impact on the other economic areas in the world. And this is something that we try to show on our report on global inequalities. How do you want Brazil, India, or South Africa to have a progressive tax policy if we, Europe, the United States, we are going through wild competition in order to reduce these rates even more? What we insist on in this report is that this model of development, which is unequal and to which Europe contributed, it is something which has had very negative consequences on the prospects of reducing poverty in the world, because those unequal trajectories that exist in Brazil, in India, in Western Africa, in South Africa, we can see that there are some very different evolutions of the world poverty. And because of these policies that we are today implementing, because we are trying to favor more and more the wealthiest, then we contribute to an unequal model, which is much more harmful than in Europe. Because in Europe, we have, social security and we have some social benefits, but in other countries, it's not necessarily the case. So when these countries do not manage to tax companies on their territories or to tax the wealthiest people, in order to develop the beginning of a public system or an education system, well, it makes things extremely complex. So we need to stop thinking that Europe is shining its equality light on the world. We need to take responsibility of what we built, and we need to understand that we exaggerated this system of generalized competition between the different countries when it comes to tax rates. Now, before talking about the possible way forward and how to democratize and how to develop a more egalitarian model for Europe, I would like to insist on one particular thing. It is the fact that in Europe, during the last 10 to 20 years, we might have entered into a model which is making competition sacred, which is making property sacred. And this reminds us of this current that existed in the 19th century in favor of competition. And I'd like to mention a few examples that shows the extremely strong conflicts that there are today in Europe between the West and the East and the North and the South. Between the North and the South, we have to see that the consequences of the crisis of 2008 are extremely strong, because the narratives are very different from the North than from the South. In the North, in the dominant European powers, and first and foremost Germany and France, because France often says, okay, we didn't play a part in this, the Germans were responsible, but that's a joke. I mean, of course, France and Germany agreed on what has been done during the last 10 years. And France was greatly involved in these policies. So the narrative of what happened, in particular with Greece and more generally with the southern European countries like Portugal, Italy, Spain, etc., it says that us, Germans and French, we have been extremely generous. We had interest rates which were to about 0.20% on the market. Greece was about to pay an interest rate at 10%, and we lent Greece some money at 3 to 4%. So we believe that there was a price on the market which was 10%. Our rate was between 0 to 1, and if we land between these two rates, then it seems that we are extremely generous. But the reality is that we actually made some profits from that. It was not only about being generous, we gained from that. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not so much. In fact, there's a real conflict between these two narratives. Do we consider that the market is always fair? Do we consider that these interest rates are the expression of a justice, of a fair economic rationality? Or, conversely, do we accept a more nuanced vision on what markets are able to do? This all relates to the young traders who wake up every morning to put a price tag on a country, and it's really hard to predict what's going to happen. So that these prices are defined sometimes not accurately. I think we are using these countries in a sort of a major game. We roll the dice with these countries. So there is a speech from the dominant powers which tend to show that these inequalities are normal or natural. If there is an inequality, it comes from something which is quite natural. So that was the first example. The second example is between the East and the West of Europe. We insist a lot today when we talk about the current events, and I'm talking about the French, the Germans, etc. We insist a lot on the fact that the Central and Eastern European countries are extremely selfish. What we hear here is, okay, we have given you some incredible structural transfers. You have regained 3 to 4% of your GDP in regional funds, especially in Poland, and yet you're not grateful. You are behaving in an extremely bad way on a number of topics. But the reaction to this is the following. We have to admit that we have benefited from this integration with Eastern Europe, and we need to remind something that the Central and Eastern European leaders remind us a lot, is that the level of the wages in these countries mean that the profit rates for the Western countries are often extremely high, and the profit outflows, the net profit outflows are generally 7 to 8% of the GDP. So that doesn't mean that the Eastern and Central countries have lost something, because of course this has fueled productivity, and it's a game which benefits to everyone. However, we do need to ask ourselves if the exact level of profit and the exact level of wages is the only possible balance. We tend to consider that the prices on the market, such as the price of the wages, the price of the salaries, are at a fair level, and everything that we're doing is in fact an act of generosity. I believe that it's a vision of the economic balance which is very narrow, and it says a lot about the fact that we forgot things in history. Europe was built in the 50s and 60s, relying on much more pragmatism when it comes to private property and free markets. Germany in particular developed a system which relied on the share of powers between the employees, between the owners, etc. And it was somehow a development of a social form of property. And often our German friends are very surprised to see what the European Commission is doing, and the fact that they are offering models that are different from the anonymous society action. So Europe was built on a vision of the market and of private property, which was much more pragmatic than the one that we are trying to showcase today. It's an intellectual issue that is at stake. I think we need to rethink the market, to rethink its limits. And one of the questions that is going to come back in the next following years is going to be the question of the public debt, because when the public debt is over 1% of the GDP, at a certain point, the question of postponing this debt will not be sustainable anymore. In France and in Germany, we have extremely low interest rates, so we believe that we are in a good situation. But it won't last forever, and I think that potentially it's a bomb that might explode one day. Once more, in the 1950s, we were much more pragmatic. The good news in this whole story is that there has already been some extremely harmful crises. The public debt is only a piece of paper. It's a debt between different social groups in the population. And it might not be as important as the debt that we have towards nature or the environment. But at the end of the Second World War, France and Germany had a public debt which was of over 250% of the GDP. So it's very clear the debt was much higher than today. In 1955, there was no more debt. It was lower than 10% of the GDP. So what happened? Of course, we didn't have a budget surplus, extraordinary budget surplus, but what we did is that we got rid of this debt through different ways. Inflation, which can have a negative impact on savings, tax, exceptional taxes on private assets, and this way inflation has the impact of increasing the contribution of the wealthiest. In Germany at that time, there was high inflation, and there were also some debt rescheduling. We need to recall the Conference of London in 1953, where the entire debt of Germany was rescheduled or at least postponed. And it's a model that could be used today for Greece or for other southern European countries. In 1953, the German debt, which was about 45% of the GDP, it was not the debt inherited from the war. It was really a reconstruction debt, because Germany needed to reconstruct, to rebuild its system. So a lot of money was lent to Germany at that time. And in 1953, the choice was made to say, okay, what's important now are the new generations of Germans and Europeans. We need to invest into facilities, education, and we are going to postpone this debt. You won't have to repay us, and maybe one day we will put this question back on the table. At the time of German unification, the question was brought back to the table, and I'm not sure that things are going to happen the same way again, but basically what I'm saying is that, okay, it's great to talk about these things, but maybe it was a good choice back at the time, and the young Germans were not responsible of what happened. And it's the same today. The young Greeks are not responsible for what the governments did a few years ago, 10 to 15 years ago. So I believe that at some stage we need to make a choice. Are we talking to young generations of Europeans? Or are we imposing on them rates of unemployment of 20 to 30% because of these policies? Today in Greece, the economic activity is still extremely low, and there is no chance that the Greek debt is going to be refunded. So at some point, when the public debt reaches such high levels, I think it's better to postpone it in order to invest in growth, to invest on the young generations, to solve environmental problems, to solve facilities problems. And now I would like to conclude this presentation and to introduce my last point. What prevents today Europe to take the right decisions? I believe that there are some historical issues at stake. The narrative that we adopt collectively of the events is extremely important. And I think there is, like I said, an intellectual issue at stake. I believe in the power of ideas, of books, etc. And I think there is also an institutional issue at stake. The current European institutions were not designed to produce equality. They were not designed to organize distribution policies. They were designed to establish a big market. They were not designed to organize distribution. So how can we modify them? The first problem when it comes to tax competition is the unanimity rule. If you can put your veto, if you have the right to put on your veto on anything, then it makes things extremely complicated. So this unanimity rule is outdated. Maybe we should use majority rule. Maybe it won't solve every problem. Just to remind you how Europe works, there is, of course, the European Parliament that we will elect in 2019, and in the economic and financial sector, there is the Ministers' Council, that meets depending on the different fields we're talking about. And when it comes to the tax questions, we have this unanimity rule. And this is why nothing happens on the question of corporate tax in particular.
So if we're moving to qualified majority rule, if we look at the Amsterdam Treaty, the idea was to define a qualified majority as 55% of countries representing more than 55% of the population. So if we were to use this qualified majority rule for applied to taxation decisions, then I think that we would be able to move forward. Well, I mean, obviously Luxembourg will probably not agree to change the current situation, but it might not even solve the situation, because you'll have vetoes coming from countries which rely on this opacity. And so, by definition, an institution cannot be a parliamentary chamber. Today, I mean, the institution of sometimes resemble more the Europe of the 19th century than the Europe of the 21st century. One individual is representing 80 million people, for example. This is absolutely ridiculous. It's a machine that will lead to identity conflict automatically. So it's impossible to defend the interest of a country if you're standing alone, and then you can't come back home. Well, I'm sorry, I was standing here in the minority, and well, I'm hoping that next time I'll be in the majority. No, this is not how it works. Even though there was a qualified majority for fiscal decisions and taxation decisions, then it will not lead to a calm and peaceful decision-making process. And therefore, obviously, no country wants to look as it just lost. So, unfortunately, these ministries' councils, well, usually they would announce, in the middle of the night that, yes, they managed to save Europe. It's been happening regularly since 2008, and then we realize that they don't even know themselves what they decided, and we don't know it either. So this governance model is very peculiar, very odd. And currently, the theory on Europe, I remember when Obama was visiting the European Parliament, he said, well, finally someone explained to me see how bicameralism worked in Europe. So you have on one side the House of Representatives, that is just like the European Parliament, and then you have the Ministries of Council Ministry Council, that is just like the Senate, for example. So, well, I mean, Obama, well, I don't know whether he cared very much whether Europe was working or not, but at least he understood. So finally we have this European bicameralism with the European Parliament on one side and the Council of Ministers on the other side. Well, I mean, this is absolutely not true, because in the US, well, I mean, imagine if you have on one side New York and then on the other California, that represent a huge chunk of the population, so just like France and Germany for the European Union. If, well, the governor of California was the only representative of California just to implement a project that would apply to California, well, no, this is not how it works. It is absolutely impossible. So in France, we have French representatives that are not necessarily representatives of the state. No, well, so and in the US, obviously, they also have differences between state level and federal level. So we can't really compare the American institutions with the European institution. So another theory would say that we should deprive the Council of its powers and then put them in the Parliament. So we would have a European Council that would then offer some decisions to the Parliament, and the Parliament would take the decisions. And I think that this vision is just as wrong as the previous one. Well, first of all, because I don't believe that the governments are ready to stand back. And even if they do, if there is this transfer of competences, then I don't think that it would work, because European liberalism lacks ambition. There would be a conflict of democratical legitimacy. Because you have on one side the national parliaments. The French national parliament has been voting for centuries now on taxation, on social welfare states, they handle budgets, they handle 30 to 40% of our GDP. So their mission is to also set the tax rates. This is their main mission. So if we transfer these competences, these decisions to the European Parliament, so if you deprive the national parliaments of these crucial competences, then obviously there will be an issue of democratic legitimacy. The risk for national MPs would be, well, for them to start a conflict with European institutions. They would disregard any European responsibility, whereas I believe that national MPs are, well, the ideal situation would be for national MPs to also be European MPs. Nowadays, national issues become European issues, and so the only solution is for some of our national MPs, so from Assemblée Nationale in France, Bundestag in Germany, so that they work together. This was one proposal that was made by Fischer in 2000 in Berlin in his speech, and no one really took that decision, but if you go back to his speech, you'll see that this is exactly what he proposed: to have a European Assembly made of national MPs. And so this is exactly what we are also advocating in our treaty for democratization of Europe. Now, of course, this is not a finished work, it still needs to be improved, but we propose to countries who wish to do so to move forward with a certain number of countries that share the same will. So we're not touching on the structure of the European Union. We're not even touching the treaties or anything. So, depending on, well, regardless of the number of new countries that want to join this new assembly, well, this new assembly would be made of, for 80% of its members of national parliaments. So Bundestag in Germany, Assemblée nationale in France. Of course, respecting national proportions, so 40 members from the Bundestag, 30 from Assemblée nationale, 20 from the Spanish National Assembly, depending on the population rate. And you would also have members that are European MPs and are working, of course, for the European institutions and are not impacted by national elections. What's important here is to have European parliamentary sovereignty that is not in conflict and in opposition with national parliaments, but which relies on national support and which also forces national MPs to explain the legislations to the population. So we couldn't simply consider that it is Europe's responsibility and that it's not a national responsibility. No, you are forced to say, well, yeah, you know, a part of us, some of us have adopted such and such legislation, have adopted a European budget. So this assembly, this chamber, could also, for example, vote for a common corporate income tax, or even a common individual's income tax. It would be a progressive rate, helping out those who earn the least, and they would be contributing the least as well. So that way, we wouldn't be in a situation where every country, and including France, is trying to rip their neighboring countries off. We all know that there is a huge tax competition between countries. We tried to carry out some measures that did not work, that were supposed to favor the installation of foreign companies in France, but this is not exactly working, and obviously every country has tricks trying to lower corporate income tax without actually touching the rate. So there are many ways, subsidies that you can work. But so the game is never going to be fair. So as long as we do not have a political chamber that will vote on budgets and legislations in the name of all Europeans, and we don't need to have the 28 countries, in fact, we can do it with, let's say, France, Germany, Italy and Spain. That represents 80% of European GDP, and I'm sure that there will be other countries as well that will also be interested, but we don't need to have the 28 countries. This is a cooperation model that we're offering that can also work for other topics, other issues. So if you're cooperating with countries from different regions of the world, rather than finding ways to overcome democracy, to bypass democracy, if we can create a European chamber, a Euro chamber, and grant them some specific competences, then I think that it would be one way for us to build a European democratic sovereignty. Right, I think I'll stop here by simply mentioning that I know that whenever we have this type of debate, many say, well, you know, no one is ever going to change, we will not change the treaties, so I mean, why would we be talking about this? And talking about institutions is boring. But if you don't want to talk about how how democracy is organized, well, those who are going to benefit from this statu quo are the people who don't need help. So we need to have this discussion. And then second point, the idea that treaties will never change. This is absolutely wrong. Look at what happened in the past, in 2012. In just 1 month, we came up with a new fiscal treaty. It was negotiated between France and Germany simply because the French public debt rate actually reached 4 to 5%, and so it was going to be very difficult for France. It was going to be absolutely dramatic, and so France was going to buy new securities to lower its interest rate, and it then got in touch with Germany. Germany agreed, and in 3 weeks they came up with a new treaty. It was easily ratified. So we'll be facing new crises in the future. I don't know whether there will be financial crises or different types of crises, or maybe a crisis following a referendum again. But what I know is that things will not stop here. So we need to debate about the possibility of having new treaties, and many of them will lead to also chaotic changes. But if we look at the former treaty that could easily be considered as a super Maastricht treaty, now we have a 0.5% of secondary deficit allowed. So after debt interest, currently Italy pays 4% of its GDP in debt interest only. So it represents a huge amount of money. Italians will actually spend it will take 4 times longer for Italians to repay their debt, and they'll also be investing 4 times more money from individuals into repaying their debt than other countries, and this is because of this new treaty. So we need to have this debate today, not because it will necessarily happen next week, but because at some point things will change. And if we're not prepared enough, if people don't complain enough about the institutions today, then we'll be in a difficult situation tomorrow. Right, I think I'll stop here. I'm afraid I was a bit long, but I'll be very happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Merci infiniment pour cette intervention extrêmement riche.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I'm sure that we'll be able to continue the debate amongst ourselves. Just to say a few words to those listening to us. I'd like to thank Aoust as well, because I didn't mention them in the beginning. It's very important as well to know that our foreign correspondents will also publish their debates, and you'll find the content of their debates in written form on their website. So thank you very much to all of you watching us from abroad. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Une certaine idée de l'Europe.
Une certaine idée de l'Europe.
L'Europe.
Ici,
Une certaine idée de l'Europe.
c'est un débat intellectuel à l'échelle continentale. Avec le groupe d'études géopolitiques, nous pensons qu'aujourd'hui l'Europe est un ensemble de nations qui ne communiquent pas à l'échelle continentale, surtout parce qu'elles n'arrivent pas à mettre en commun des disciplines et des intellectuels qui sont eux mondiaux. C'est important qu'une génération qui se sent européenne commence immédiatement à se saisir des questions européennes en venant de sensibilités politiques différentes et en partageant des points de vue intellectuels différents. Myriam Revaud-Dallon parlera en direct à l'ENS le 4 mai. C'est une des plus grandes spécialistes au monde de sciences politiques. C'est une philosophe politique extrêmement puissante. Elle pense le concept de la représentation, elle le pense à partir des arts, à partir des archives historiques, et c'est pour la première fois qu'elle traitera des questions européennes. Vous pouvez nous rejoindre à l'École normale supérieure de Paris, si vous êtes à Paris. Mais si vous n'êtes pas à Paris, l'idée du CID, d'une certaine idée de l'Europe, c'est de pouvoir partager le débat sur l'échelle continentale. Nous avons donc 2 retransmissions à plusieurs villes européennes, de Tallinn jusqu'à Lisbonne, de Cambridge jusqu'à Rome. Et évidemment, nous sommes sur les réseaux sociaux, donc vous pouvez nous suivre par là.